We are going to make a growing strawberry animation using geometry nodes, and I'll show you how it's done step by step. It may seem complicated, but it's actually quite simple if you know how it's done. This is not going to be one of those tutorials where you just sit and go along like a mindless robot adding these nodes not knowing what the hell you are doing. You are actually going to learn something. But if you don't want to do this animation, it's also on my Gumroad for a small price. So let's get started straight away. So this is what it looks like. We've got our strawberry right here, and as you move it backwards, it's growing outwards. The strawberries will change color because we can add that easily. This will basically be the animation that we're going to be recreating today. Now, this is what the geometry node setup looks like. And I know it may seem very daunting at first, but actually it's the same process over and over again. And once you understand what happens, it's very easy, and I'm going to explain step by step what is going on. I'm going to open a new Blender file, so don't save. I'm going to delete this, and the first things I am going to bring in are my leaf and my strawberry. You can get the leaf for free on Patreon or Gumroad, and there's also different selections of stuff, so if you want everything from this free course, it will have a price, and some things do not have a price. Go ahead and check that out, but I actually recommend following this tutorial so you learn a thing or two. So we are going to start by bringing in a curve Bezier. So Shift A, curve, Bezier, and right here we have this curve. I am actually going to do RY90 and make sure it goes upwards. I will bring this to the side and I will make some drawings for you to understand what is going to happen at first. I'm going to press on new, and right here we have this geometry. I'm going to bring in my drawing tool, and the way I like to approach geometry nodes is by thinking to myself, what do I want to have happen? So I ask myself these questions. The first thing is, naturally, I want to make a growing fruit. But from there on, we really don't know what to do yet. So we have to break this up in smaller questions. And I'm going to explain that soon, but first I want to go over some basic knowledge for geometry nodes. So let's say you have a painter. Now this painter has all types of different colors. He has red, he has blue, and he knows those colors. He knows it's red, he knows it's blue. The same goes for geometry nodes. We need to know what some of these nodes do before we can use them, otherwise you have no basis in trying to go about this. So we need to know the properties of some nodes if you want to learn geometry nodes properly. And the best way to do it, of course, is by following tutorials, having used the nodes before in some other projects, and now you know it exists, and then you can use it in your own project. But it's basically the same as the painter. Now, the painter might be lacking some knowledge, because if you have blue and red and you combine it with each other, then you get purple. Well, the same goes for geometry nodes. Sometimes there are nodes that need to be combined in order to get to a certain result. And we have to know this. And there's no simple way to just know it automatically unless you know how to ask the right questions, which is what we're going to do right now. So basically what a growing plant with a fruit animation is, it's a plant. This is a plant. It has some leaves sticking out of this. So this is a leaf. Right over here we have a leaf. And we also have some fruits growing out of this. So this is our beautiful looking strawberry. Now if we break this down and ask ourselves the right questions, what is actually happening? We have a curve. This curve is going to be the plant. The curve needs to have some thickness. So we should probably want to give a radius to this curve. Now this curve has points. So right over here we have all these points in the curve. And we can select those points and make sure that another curve grows out of it with our leaf on it, for example, or our strawberry. Beautiful looking strawberry for you guys. Now, if we approach it like this, we already know what questions to ask during the process. Okay, so we need a curve. We've got a curve right here, so that is done. Now, how do we give this curve some depth? And you have to ask yourself these questions throughout the process all the time in order to get to the result. So I want this curve to have some thickness. How do I do it? Well, I go over here, I type curve, and I just have a look. Curve tip, curve root. Now naturally, as I said before, you need to know what some nodes do. So I'm going to add a node set curve radius. And now we've got this right over here, but it still doesn't have a radius. Well, why not? Well, because this information is not enough. Here it doesn't have a radius, and the reason for it is because it's just a thin line with points. There is nothing to be radiused, to say it like a dummy. But we can change that, because we can change the curve into something that we can work with. Now what is something that is not a curve? It's a mesh, obviously. So I'm going to take Shift A, curve, to mesh. And now we can change this curve into a mesh. But still nothing happens. Why? Well, we have an extra option right here, profile curve. This will determine the profile, or what it looks like, in this node. So what we need to add is a curve circle. And we can use the curve circle as the profile for this curve. And now we actually have something to work with. which is very interesting. Now watch what happens if I increase the radius. It is going to increase the radius of the entire curve. So let's follow this thought process for a second. We've got a curve. Basically it's non-existent because a curve doesn't have any geometry. So we told the curve to get some radius. We don't have a radius yet because there's no geometry. So we have to turn this into a geometry. Now how do we do that? By using a curved circle to give it some depth. And now that we've given it some depth, the set curve radius node will work. One thing I do not like about this curve is the fact that it is all straight. Now if you look at plants, they usually become thinner near the top. I think the reason for this might be because they are consuming from the soil. So the closer it is to the source, the more food it will take, and the longer and more energy it requires to go all the way to the top, so it becomes thinner, and that is more efficient. That's my personal reasoning for it. I'm not sure if this is correct, but it sounds logical. So we want to change this. So we want this to be pretty thick over here, but thin over here. And this is where the knowledge about the nodes comes into play. But it's also very important to know which questions to ask if you do not have this knowledge. So just for example's sake, I'm going to Google curve radius at the end of a curve in geometry nodes Blender. This is a valid question, so let's see what answers we get. And here we have a Reddit post trying to change the radius of a curve in edit mode, and right here in the description I can already see you could change the radius using a float curve node with the curve parameter as input. The result would go into your set curve radius node. So now we know that the curve parameter is something. It's actually got a different name right now. It's called spline parameter. So I'm going to bring that over here. Spline parameter. It used to be called the curve parameter. And you have to be wary about this, that in new versions and new updates in Blender, it might change the name. But it's called spline parameter. And basically what the spline parameter does, get my beautiful looking pencil. Spline parameter basically says, this is a curve and this has a 0 and a 1. And we are going to interpolate the values in between this. So it's going from 0 to 1. And this will be thin. And it's very thin in the beginning. And as we move upwards, it will become thicker and thicker and thicker. This is what the spline parameter does. And this is what our curve will look like as soon as I plug the factor into the radius of the set curve radius node. There you go. It is now thin. It is now thin at the top and thick at the bottom. And now we want to find a way to adjust the parameter of this. So the first thing that you might come up with is to drop in a color ramp, which is not a very bad idea. I see how this makes sense, but it doesn't work at all. So we have to delete this. And then we ask ourselves, how can I decide a range between 0 and 1? Well, we have a node for that. It's called the map range node. And it's basically deciding between 0 and 1. So map range node. Plug it right over here, and we can change the values of this, and you can already see that things are happening with our little curve. If you are finding problems, deselect clamp, and then things will work out. Sometimes the clamp might result in a problem, just so you know. So this is basically the setup that we are going to use for our plant, and I want to show you something. The group input is something that we can redraw. There are other parts of this node that we cannot redraw. We have to make them from scratch in geometry nodes, but this one we have the freedom to recreate. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going into edit mode, select all of this, vertices, delete it. Then I'm going to select this little drawing tool, and I will go from the bottom to the top. Now the first thing you may notice is that the 0 value is at the beginning. How do I know it's the beginning? Well, I started drawing from the bottom to the top. So I know this is the beginning and this is the end. And that is going to give us some problems in the future. So I want to be ahead of the curve. I'm going into the map range node, and I'm going to change the 2 min from 0 to 1 and the 2 max from 1 to 0. And now we've basically inverted the spline parameter. And now we can use the from max and from min values to change this curve and the way it looks. And that is the way that we can manipulate our curve. But one thing that might annoy you, it annoys me, is the fact that it is very sharp around these edges. And as we make our plant animation, you don't want it to look like that. You want it to be smooth. And that's why we can change the amount of points in this curve. And as you can see, we have 3 points, but we actually want to tell the data as if there are more points. So I'm going to use a node for that. Shift A, resample curve. It's basically recounting how many points are in the curve. So I'm going to drag this on here, and I'm going to increase the count. And I'm going to draw this like so. And if I decrease this count, you will be able to see that our plant would be very ugly looking if we only have 9 points. But if we have 100 points, for example, it's very smooth. So I'm going to delete all of this for now. I'm going to draw it back in, just make it like this. And the next thing that we want to do is ask ourselves the right question. So now basically we've got our curve. It has enough points for us to work with, so it's smooth. It has a radius, it has some mesh that actually shows up in the viewport. And now we want to animate it. So how can we make this curve animate? That is already the question in itself. You can ask that on Google and you will find the answer. It's going to be a trim curve node. Trim curve. And let's place this right over here for now. And you will see that we actually get a problem. Why? Well, we've changed the curve to a mesh. And this is not a trim mesh node, which doesn't exist. So I'm going to take this, hold Alt, you can drag it away from the line and bring it right over here when it's still a curve. And watch what will happen if we animate this end value. The curve is being built up. And that is exactly what we want. So this is the basis of our curve. I hope this was all very clearly explained so you know exactly what happened. And we're going to move on now. I'm going to make a curve that has a strawberry on it so that we can spawn it on our actual plant. Because this is redrawable, which means that if I delete all of these points and I draw in it, then we can make different setups with strawberries on them later on. While if we were to do a different method, it just doesn't work out. I'm going down. So I'm going down and I'm actually even going to cut this line. Hold Control, right mouse click. I'm going to cut the line. I'm going to take the group input, bring it down because we want to make a new curve. Shift A, Bezier. I'm going to add a quadratic Bezier right over here, which is basically a node that is a curve in itself, but we cannot draw it. But we are going to use it anyway. So I'm going to plug this in. And as you can see, it is right over here. So it's a very small curve. And things can be done very simply right now because we've already got the original setup that we need for this. So I'm going to take all of this, duplicate it, delete the group input, plug this Bezier into the curve and the curve to mesh into the geometry of the group output. And as you can see, we now have a pretty interesting looking curve. So right here we have the quadratic Bezier, but one problem that we are going to run into later is that it starts from -1, which means that this point is not going to be located on the curve of the plant. That is a problem. So we can solve that simply by setting this to 0. And now when we have our original curve, which is going to be right over here, it will be spawned on the correct location. Now we might have to change some things in the future, but I'm not going to do that right now. It's much easier when we can see what we are doing. So continuing, we have our curve right over here. It's the exact same setup, except that we cannot draw it. So now we need to add our strawberry. So I'm going to press Shift A, instance on points. I'm going to drag it right over here. As you can see, our curve disappears. And that is because there's nothing to be spawned on this curve. So I'm going to take the strawberry and drag it right over here. And now we've got our object. But before we are going to drag this geometry into the instance, we are going to spawn 100 strawberries on these points. Because we have 100 points, this will instance it on the points. So that will be 100 strawberries. Your PC might not be able to handle this. Mine can. So I'm going to drag it in there anyway, just so I can show you. So we've got this right over here, and of course it becomes very slow. And what we have to do in order to fix this is to make sure that we have only one strawberry, because the strawberry should be at the very end of this line. And there's a node for it. And we can plug that node into the selection. Basically what the selection does is that it looks at the points that we have over here. We can take a selection of those points and do all of those things in that selection. So I'm going to press Shift A and point selection. I've got it right over here. I'm going to drag the selection into the selection. I'm going to set the start size to 0. And as you can see, we run into a problem. But this problem can be solved very easily. The reason why it does this is because we have dragged in the curve to mesh. And now it's actually a mesh going into these points. So the easy way to fix it would be to take the trim curve and drag that one into the points. And now we have the strawberry only at the end of our selection. But we cannot see our selection anymore because we disconnected it. So we have to bring it back. I'm going to hold Shift, right mouse click, drag it right over here. I'm going to make this a bit more organized. Have this line go over there. Take the curve to mesh, bring it over here. And now I will add a join geometry node. Join geometry. I'm going to drag it right in between here. And we basically want our curve and we want our strawberry. So I'm going to take this mesh and join the geometry. And now we have our curve, which is right over there. And we have our strawberry. But as you can see, the strawberry is very big. If we change the scale of this, you can see it is actually being spawned on the end of our curve, which is exactly what we want. But there are a couple of other problems now. The strawberry is definitely not aligned on the place that we want it to be. So if we animate this, you can see that the strawberry is kind of moving along with the endpoint, but it's facing our direction. Now, of course, you can change this by changing the rotation right over here. It will work out. something like this, but as you can see, it still doesn't move along with the curve. So I'm going to show you how to solve this problem right now. I'm going to set this to 0. So we need some space. And what I want to do is make an align Euler to vector. So I'm going to press Shift A, align Euler to vector. And basically this is a node to change the rotation. So I'm going to plug the rotation into the rotation. And as you can see, something already happens. We can play around with these values to rotate our strawberry around. Now, if you want the strawberry to follow the curve directly, there is a node that we can add. However, it's going to bring us some more problems, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to bring in a curve tangent node right over here. And basically a curve tangent, if I take out my little drawing board, so let's say we have a curve like this. A curve tangent basically looks at all the vectors of a curve. So this is going like so, and this is going like so, and like this, and that is the direction that the curve is headed in. And you will see very soon that as I plug this into the vector and change this to z, our strawberry will be aligned with this curve throughout the entire animation. So if I just work it like this, it is moving along with the tangent of the curve. However, the problem with this is that it doesn't give us the smoothest animation. As you can already see right here, when it becomes a bit jittery, it is moving ahead frame by frame like this. And I have not found an actual solution to have this work well during animation. But if you want to make a still render, this is a very good node to use. Because in that case, we can just draw a new curve and the strawberries will always be aligned correctly. But for the animation, we have to do it manually. So I'm going to delete the curve tangent and I will bring in a rotate rotation. I think it was called rotate Euler before. I'm going to bring it right over here, set this to end, and now I am going to change the strawberry. And then later on, when we've decided what our curve actually looks like, we can animate it, because now it's not going along with the tangent. We have to animate it by hand going along. And that is the best solution that I found for this in order to make it do good. But I just wanted to give you that little nugget of information as well, if you simply want to make a still render. So this is the setup for our strawberry. It's very simple. It's basically the same as this, but we added a couple of new nodes. Now we need to combine it. And what I want to have happen is that on the points of this original plant, we spawn our new creation right here, which is basically the curve with the strawberry. I'm going to drag this upwards as well. And I'm going to add a new join geometry node right over here. And now we want to instance on points this entire setup. So I'm going to take an instance on points, duplicate it, but I don't want it to have 100 points because our PC will definitely crash. So the way to fix this problem is to drag this upwards. I will take the trim curve and set it to curve to points. Right over here, curve in the curve, points in the points. And now we have only 10 points for this. And in this way, we retain the smoothness of our plant, but we also have another set of points to work with in our instance on points node. So that's why we do that. I'm going to take this join geometry, because this is the entire setup that we've made. And I'm going to plug it into the instance on points. And the instance can go into the new join geometry. And as you can see, we now have our line, which has different points that we can spawn our strawberries on. And if we increase the count of the curve to points, it will bring more of those strawberries, which is exactly what we want, but we lost our plant, which is why we brought our curve to mesh right over here. And we can plug this into the join geometry as well. So now we basically have our plant with those strawberries on it. But as you can see, the rotation of this is all going in the same direction. And the way to fix that is to go over here, add an index node. Then I'm going to add a combine XYZ, index into the Z, vector into the rotation. And now it will be rotated all along this curve. And we can play around with these values to have them move in a different direction. So what I'm going to do right now is draw a curve that I think is to my liking. So I'm going into edit mode, delete all of this, and draw a curve that I think looks pretty cool. So let's do something like this. And now we can already see that our strawberries are a bit too small. So we can go over to the quadratic Bezier and increase the endpoint of this, because then the strawberries will move further. I also think that the middle doesn't have too much randomization. So we can change this by taking the X and Y values and making sure that we give an interesting looking shape to this plant. Of course, I also think that this is a bit too linear. So I want to change this curve to be a bit more randomized, as if it's an actual plant. And the way to do it is by adding a set position and randomizing it using the noise texture. So I'm going to bring all of this down. I will bring this to the side to make some more space, add in a set position node, and this decides where the position is of our curve. And we want to randomize each point in the position. So I'm going to bring in a noise texture, and I will also bring in a vector math node right over here. The reason why I add this is because this operates from 3 values, but it's only in the positive, but we have to get it in the negative as well. So we wanted to go from 0.5 to minus 0.5 instead of 0 to 1, because then it will be skewed towards one side. Don't want that. Color in the vector, change this to subtract and set this to 0.5 because we are subtracting it by 0.5, and set it into the offset. And as you can see, we already get a pretty interesting looking curve right here. But we want to change the scale to something very low. 0.2, maybe 0.5, something like this. And we can play around with these values later on. So there are 2 problems that we run into now. Trim curve nodes are both separated, and I don't want to go in there and animate it exactly at the right timing. So we're going to do it using geometry nodes anyways. And the way to do it is by taking this group input, and I will select this little box that has no value, and I will bring it into the end value of the trim curve. And as you head over to the modifier panel right over here, it says end. And if I animate this, we actually get the curve. But we want these to grow as this one grows. So we also have to take this end and bring it into this trim curve. And now everything will grow at the same time, but there's still a problem, namely the scale of our strawberries. We don't want the strawberries, so for example, I'm going to increase the scale. It's going to be the same scale all the way from over here, but they need to grow through time. And the way to fix that is by actually using math nodes. So I'm going to add a math node right over here. I'm going to set it to multiply. I'm going to take the end value from the group input, which we've got right over there. And let's just make a new group input so it becomes a bit more clean. And into this value, and this value can go into, let's bring it right over there. And this value can go into the scale. And now if we animate this, the scale will also animate. And we can increase the size of our strawberries right over here. So in this way we can scale the strawberries and the plant at the same time. So let's take all of this and press Shift P, and now it will be in its own group. And we can move everything around easily using this. And we can also press on N, and this is called frame. I'm going to call it strawberry, and the label should also be strawberry. Now I want to change the color. I'm going to make it red, because in this fashion we know that this is our strawberry. First, let's clean this up a bit. We've got 2 lines going from this geometry to this join geometry. So I'm going to hold Shift, click right over here, and now it just is 1 dot. And that makes it a bit more clear. I'm also going to take the curve to mesh, do the same thing, and make sure that we can see where the lines are actually going, and this is a bit more organized. Now for the next part we are going to make the leaf, and it's going to be the exact same as the strawberry. So bear with me, we're almost there. So right now we have got our strawberries, we've got the main plant, and all that we need to add is the leaf. So we are going to do that right now. We've got the leaf right over here. I'm going to drag it in here, but I'm also going to take all of this because the setup is basically going to be the same. So I'm going to take all of this, Shift D, bring it down, and make sure that it is not in this group. So I'm going to make a new group for this, and I will call it leaf. Now I'm going to take our leaf, and I'm going to bring it right over here, and switch it out for the strawberry. This one into the instance. Now let's move this to the side. Let's duplicate these 3 nodes. Bring it right over here. I'm going to duplicate the join geometry as well. Take this curve, bring it right in there. Take this and set it into the instance of the instance on points node. And now let's drag this into the join geometry as well. Now let's increase the scale of this. Let's have a look. So what we are missing are the stems for this, and that's because we do not have this curve to mesh. So in order to get that done, let's take this join geometry, let's bring it right over here. Let's plug in this curve to mesh as well into this join geometry. And now as you can see, we will also have some leaves. Of course, we have to play around with the align unit vector right over here. And make sure that it has something that looks a bit more correct. And we can make it a whole lot smaller. So I'm going to take this size. Now the leaves are a bit too small as well. So I'm going to take this multiply and increase the size of this. Let's have a look at this. So let's go over here to Eevee, set it to cycles, set it to GPU. I'm going to take this, bring in an HDRI right over here. I've added in an HDRI, and this is starting to look pretty cool. So we've got our leaves, but the problem is that it's going through this mesh. And the reason for it is that the origin point of this leaf is probably not at the right location. So let's go over to this leaf. Dot. Let's have a look at this. Ah, there you have it. The leaf does not have the correct origin point. So I'm going to scoof this over to the side. G and Y, G and Z, and make sure it starts right over there. And now we have some leaves. And of course we can also change the amount of leaves by bringing in a curve points right over here. Since we are using the same curve points in this one, what we can also do is take this, Ctrl-Shift-D and bring it down. Then take this and use that one as the points. And now we can increase the amount of leaves that we have right over here. So the only thing left to do is to give this a material, and then we're going to set up a scene so that it looks cinematic. And there's a couple of tricks that we can use to do that. Then we have to animate everything and make sure that it looks cool. So everything is scaling up, the leaves are scaling up, the strawberry is scaling up, like this. And everything is starting to look pretty nice. I don't like that the leaves are all growing from one side. So I'm going over here to this instance on points node. Perhaps in this case, we don't want to use this node. We actually want to use a different one. So I'm going to unplug it from the rotation. And I'm going to bring in a random value right over here. Set it to vector. I'm going to take an align Euler to vector. Make sure you plug it into the top rotation, by the way. And now we can play around with these settings in the line Euler to vector to have our leaves go in whatever direction we would like. All right, so let's give this some materials. I'm going to add a set material node. And the first place I'm going to plug it in is all the way at the top here. Make a new material in the shader editor. Let's select this material, it's material 003. And I'm going to add a noise texture. I'm going to add a color ramp, plug this in there, Ctrl-T, use the normals, plug the color into the base color. And now we need to make it some type of green. So I'm going to make this a green color right over there. And this should be a darker green color somewhere over here. This of course doesn't look very good as of yet. Play around with the scale, detail and the roughness. And then we're going to increase the scale on the Y and also plug in the normal into the vector. So now we get those type of edges that we see right over here. We can pronounce that a bit by bringing these closer together. And this is starting to look like one of those stems. It's a bit too green and CG-like. So right over here, I'm going to add a add shader, add a translucent BSDF, plug it in here, take the color for this and plug it into the color. And now also bring in a hue, saturation and value node, decrease the saturation and increase the value. Something like this should probably do the trick. But I still think this doesn't look very good. So I played around with the values a bit and I used the hex color for the light side, BOE708. And for the dark side, I'm going to use 176F00. Like so. For the hue, saturation and value node, I'm going to set this to 0.5, saturation to 2 and the hue to 0.44. Then I will go over here, change the scale to 5 and change the Y to approximately 39. Now I'm going to duplicate the noise texture. I'm going to bring in a color ramp, factor into the factor, and this will go into the roughness. Then the black color I will bring upwards just a little bit. Now if we want to change this color, we can also add a hue, saturation and value node right over here. And now we can easily change the hue of this and the light values of this green piece. I'm heading over into the leaf texture as well, which we've got right over here. And I have added a hue, saturation and value and a color ramp. And now we can change the color of this in the exact same fashion. So it's a translucent with an add shader, hue, saturation and value, same over here, and the color ramp into the roughness, in order to make sure it doesn't look that shiny or too bleak. We can change the hue of this to 0.6 or whatever color you like. I think 0.54 also looks pretty good. And now we can play around with this. So bringing this down again, we've got our material now. So go over to the geometry nodes editor, go to set material and place it in between every curve to mesh. And I'm going to take it over here as well. So now it is all the same color of green. So we've added all the materials. There's one right over here, there's one right over here, and there's one right over here. And now everything should look pretty good. You can play around with the values of the colors if you'd like. And now I'm going to teach you some tricks on how to make this more cinematic looking. So I'm going to pick this HDRI, it's called Industrial Sunset. One thing that's annoying me is this big strawberry here at the bottom. And the reason why this happens is because of our quadratic Bezier, which spawns from this point. And we can easily fix that by taking this, going into edit mode and dragging it upwards or in whatever fashion we would like it to be. So right over there, there's a blue sky. I think that looks pretty interesting. And I think the lighting will look fine over there as well. So I'm going to place my geometry node setup somewhere over here. And now I'm going to place a camera, let's say right over here. So Ctrl-Alt-0 to place the camera. And and I'm going to increase the focal length for this. So I'm going to increase the focal length to somewhere around 110. So I'm going to the strawberry and I'm going to increase the amount right over here in the length of our curve. And in this way I can manipulate where the strawberries will end up. There are too many leaves. And actually I'm not going to show all of this. We made a geometry node setup for a reason. So now you can access all of these features right over here. I think it's very clear and simple what's happened here. So this is our main branch. We've got our strawberry and we've got our leaf. And you can access all of the different features right in here. So I think you should be able to do this for yourself. So let's go to the leaves right over here. Maybe we actually just want to use a random value straight in the rotation. And then we can change this around as well. Let's add some more curves to this. So subdivide it, take this, and now we can shape it in such a fashion that it actually looks the way that we want it to. Now let's go into the camera and go to depth of field. I'm going to add a empty. So I'm going to add the empty right over here. And I want the camera to focus on this empty. So take this picker tool and select the empty. And now this strawberry will be in focus, while the ones in the back will have a higher depth of field. This already looks a bit more cinematic, but there's another trick that we can use. So I'm going over here. So I'm going into pixels and I'm going to type 3 and I'm trying to find an image that has a lot of things like this, for example, or something like this. So let's download it just straight away and you can find whatever picture you would like. I'm going to press Shift A, image, bring in images as planes, and now it's right over there. So I'm going to bring it backwards by a whole bit and I will scale it up. And now I'm going into the camera, go to the depth of field and decrease the f-stop until we get a circular type bokeh. And this will already make it look a whole lot more cinematic. Let's bring this upwards and let's drag this into the emission as well. Color into the emission, increase the strength a bit. Maybe there's a better picture. All right, so I'm going to use this picture. Then I'm going to add a light area lamp, increase the scale of this, bring it right over there to the side and increase the power by a bit. And then we will have a nice edge light on our strawberries, which adds a whole lot to this render, by the way. So just make sure to locate it with a slight angle towards the front of our strawberries. And as you can see, we will have some highlights over here as if the sun is shining. Go into the camera, view per display, passe-partout. And this is what we are actually seeing. We can play around with the bokeh and make sure it looks pretty cool. Maybe something like this. And this is already a pretty nice looking render if you ask me. We can play around, of course, with the settings in the geometry nodes. So if I think the strawberry should be a bit more located in my direction, I can definitely do that by playing with the rotate rotation in the align unit vector. And this is now the way our render looks. As you can see, the bokeh makes it look a whole lot more cinematic, even though we didn't change that much. So there's only two things left to do for this tutorial. We have to make a texture animation for this strawberry so that as it approaches, it will change its color because it's ripening. And we also have to make an animation out of this, naturally. This is already starting to look pretty good if you ask me. It's starting to look kind of photorealistic. So let's go over to our strawberry and make an animation for this. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this, everything except for the displacement. And I'm going to bring this upwards. And now I want to change the color of the strawberry. So I'm going to take this, make it a bit more yellow. Take this, make it a bit more yellowish, greenish. And maybe make this a bit more greenish as well. We can play around with these values until we get to something that looks like it hasn't finished ripening yet. So all we did is change the color, but now we need to make a mechanism that allows us to change from this to this. So I'm going to select both of these, Control 0, it will make a mix shader, and I will basically drive the factor of this using a gradient texture. So I'm going to add a gradient texture right here, Control T to get the mapping node. I'll plug it in here, and let's see what it looks like for now. Bring in a color ramp. And let's play around with this. It is coming from the side. We actually want it to be coming from the bottom. So change the Y rotation to 90. And now it is coming from the bottom. But it's very linear right now. So if we were to animate this, it's not going to look entirely in the way that we want it to be. So I'm going to add a noise texture. I'm going to bring in a math node right over here. Plug the factor into the math node. And I will also bring in a mix color right over here, value into B, and let's set mix to linear light. And now this is what it looks like. But if we increase or decrease the add, it will give us this cool looking animation. And of course we can change the values of the noise texture as well to increase the detail, for example, and maybe play around with the roughness a little bit. Something like this, play around with the scale. And do whatever you like and whatever you think looks good. I think this is randomized enough, so I'm going to work with it And we can now transition from one texture to another. I will show you by clicking on this mix shader and play around with this. And now it becomes a strawberry slowly over time. It's a bit noisy, but right here we have the half value and it is moving away, becoming a strawberry exactly as we want it to. But we can only make the keyframes for this once we know how our curve will progress. So that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to click on the geometry node section, I'm going to change this to timeline. And right here on the very first frame, I'm going to take this and set it to 0. And then right on frame 200, let's say, I'm going to set it to 1. Let's see what it looks like. Of course, we have to take the empty selection to cursor, make sure everything is aligned. And we can rotate all of this and make sure that it looks good. But this is basically the way that we make this animation. I'm not going to fumble around with this too much during this tutorial because I don't want to waste your guys' time. I'm going to play around with it in the end, but this is the way it works. So you make the curve and then you make the animation and just time it using these keyframes right over here. Now, if you want it to go faster in the beginning, Control Tab, go over to the graph editor, select this, A dot, and take this line, bring it upwards, and then it will grow fast in the beginning and slow down as it progresses. And I will start our coloring animation somewhere over here. So I'm heading over into the shader editor, drag up the timeline from here so we can actually see what we are doing. And I will go over to the strawberry, go to the add node that we've made last, right over here, click on it, make sure it is green first, so bring it down, press I, and as soon as it reaches like frame 180, it should be a strawberry, something like this. And this is going way too fast, and that is because the values are lying too far outside of each other. So I'm going to have to change this until it turns green, really subtly, right over there. And now it is going too fast, because we can change this to a subtle value like 0.96. And now it will be going a lot slower. So as you can see right here, it is still green. And as it's coming towards the camera, it is turning red. And we can, of course, change the animation for this by dragging our keyframes further away. And now there's one more problem that we should animate. Strawberries have these lines that they come from, but they are not moving along correctly. They are just standing still the entire time. I actually want to rotate them in the process. So I'm going to click on our geometry node setup and scroll into our strawberry section right over here. And we've got the rotate rotation, and we're going to click on it. And now we can make some keyframes for this as well, because right over here, this is good. So I'm going to press I, because this is the way that we want it to look. And then right over here, perhaps, somewhere around here. And now we can rotate it around, something like this. And make sure, press I, bring this all the way to the beginning. And now we can also see that the strawberries are slightly rotating during this animation, which is going to look a whole lot better. So this is the animation, and I'm going to play around with these values some more to get to a result that I would like. I recommend you do the same and try to find your own way in this and make sure that it looks really cool. That's the entire reason we made a geometry node setup, so you can change things easily. I'm going to fiddle around with this just a little bit more. Now for the ending, all you need to do is go over here and make sure that you make a file for this. And then I actually recommend rendering out approximately 50 frames transparent, and then the entire render not transparent, so that we actually have this background. Because I want this animation to start from the previous animation, so it's going to come in and then it will change to this background. So we have a transparent strawberry coming in, and we can transition nicely to our next render. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, that you learned a lot and that it was easy to follow, and that you now have a pretty good looking setup just like this one, where you can access these functions easily and make changes. I hope I've explained this part of geometry nodes very well, so you can use it more freely in upcoming projects. If you're interested in all the course assets or maybe the ultimate lighting solution, check out my Gumroad. In the next video we are going to do something that has never been shown in Blender before, and it's actually one of my favorites, the strawberry slice animation. So click here to subscribe and click here to watch that video next.